I've been writing for about 20 years now. I started off going back to the question of analogies. So space is somewhat new, one of the newer domains for competition. So I started off with a maritime, using Sir Julian Corbett, who was a contemporary of Alfred Thayer Mahan for sea power strategy. And my first paper was called Corbett and What. Very catchy title. You got to have, you want people to read stuff, you got to have the catchy title. So it was Corbett in Orbit. That turned into my first book, which came out in 2006. Again, I was still on active duty Navy at the time. It's part of the literature for Space Force and part of their core curriculum. So I'm honored to have that happen. So if the first two on the far left are known as Corbett in Orbit, the first book, Understanding Space Strategy, we call Orbit is Not Enough. So you can't look to just one theorist for everything. So I bring in Clausewitz, Thucydides. Please make this open. Oh, good. We just started just rambling about my
Best seat in the house.
So I brought in Thucydides, Sun Tzu, Mao, J.C. Wiley, B.H. Littleheart, and there's lots of strategies. So I was trying to say, okay, maritime analogy is good. Let's open up the aperture. And the last book, that's what brings us here today. Next, please. So what I was wrestling with, as you read Clausewitz, and if you look at sea power and air power as inspiration, something just didn't seem right. What we were seeing for the last few decades was something. It was competition. It was something below conflict. But Clausewitz didn't really seem to help out in some of the bigger strategies. So I said, well, what is going on there? What is different? So we're looking at we have banning of direct descent hit to kill ASAT testing. We have jamming going on of satellite communications in Ukraine. We have Russia doing blowing up their own satellites, causing debris. And then we have concerns with proximity operations on orbit. So the conclusion I reached was, well, maybe what we don't need is really an analogy. We need to consider what we're seeing as a mode of warfare, in this case, irregular warfare. Next, please. What is regular warfare? So I'm going to define it. I'm not a big fan of words on slides, but just so we can kind of get our heads wrapped around it. Irregular warfare is apart from major conventional wars against an enemy who takes a similar approach. Spoiler alert, it's something that's important. Irregular warfare is not irregular. It happens all the time. That's happened for millennia. We've called it different things. We'll call it about what we're talking about. Just so you know, you may roll your eyes. Notice I defined irregular warfare as the opposite of regular warfare. But we do that in strategic studies all the time. We have the asymmetric, we have symmetry, asymmetry, and we have direct and indirect. So irregular warfare only has meaning to its opposite. Next. An old idea going by different names. So I'll let you look at these, but James Cable wrote about gunboat diplomacy. Caldwell talked about small wars. Terrorism would fit in there too. About 15 years ago, it was UTWA, military operations other than war. I guess it's technically correct. Please make yourself at home. We got some chairs over here.
Yeah.
Please. Guerrilla warfare, insurgencies, and counterinsurgencies. So all these are terms that we've used in the past. Again, the idea is not new by any means. Next, please. So some examples of irregular warfare in space. We kind of alluded to Ukraine already, but we have jamming of global positioning signals in Ukraine on both sides. Okay. We have cyber attacks against commercial companies and their infrastructure. Also, we're seeing in Ukraine. So cyber attacks against space architectures. We have commercial companies. Those are Starlink constellations providing command and control, or at least comms to Ukrainian forces. Now we have on-orbit servicing and proximity. So these are two satellites doing inspections. In this case, they would be not cooperative. In this case. So those are some examples. Let's look at the opposite, shall we? Okay.
Oh, yeah, I was waiting for a seat.
Okay.
No worries. No worries, like I said.
This is a pleasant problem. Thank you again for coming out. See one person here, or speaking to myself? Hi, it's Thursday. Oh, my God. Well, you know where to find me on Mondays.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is irregular warfare. Again, we've seen variations of this for decades. Again, GPS jamming, lazing, harassment, again, using commercial in different ways, and potentially the coercive effect. So again, let's look at the opposite. What is regular warfare? So fortunately, we don't see much of this. So let's give an example of a direct ascent, hit to kill, anti-satellite bidding GPS. So a little blue dot on my phone, where I get my tacos and my pizzas from, come into my house, courtesy of the US Space Force or Galileo or whoever's providing it. So that would be the upper left. We have variations of different weapons here, open source, but kinetic kill vehicles. So you could have a two satellites, one satellite that deliberately impacts and destroys another. You could have space-to-space lasers after exquisite intelligence community Earth observation satellites, and then everyone's favorite, rods from God. These are tungsten rods launched from orbit. We believe, depending on which literature, basically 1 to 2 kilotons warhead, probably broaching on a weapons of mass destruction again. Considered science fiction for good reason. Let's keep it that way. Next, please. All right, so we're going to talk irregular warfare again. Folks like me who write books on it. The intent isn't not to bisect. Hey, it's irregular warfare here. Is Ukraine really irregular warfare? I mean, they're still doing major. We see tanks used and stuff like that. So a lot of conflicts have elements of both. So again, irregular warfare can be merged with regular as part of hybrid, but let's not lose sight of it by bending irregular here. And there are no new neat, tidy boxes when you look at strategy and good policy things. So next. So the U.S. Space Force is grappling with this problem, but they're using different terminology. So the Chief of Space Operations, General Saltzman, and it's like breaking defense and space news. We talk about competitive endurance. So I started writing this book about 2.5 years ago. I didn't really use this term, but had it been around at the time, I would have used it. So what I like about this term is competitive endurance. Competitive is not conflict. Again, it's trying to imply something below the threshold of armed conflict. And then endurance connotes a protracted element. Okay, the time as a part of your strategy. So, when the Space Force is trying to figure out what does competitive endurance mean to its U.S. rivals, it's the other side of the coin for irregular warfare in space. I'm talking about strategy and what it is. They're trying to figure out how do you deal with it. And we'll talk about the last chapter in the book. I do to what I believe historical experience says for that. So it's very germane. It goes by different ideas, but the Space Force is all over this right. Next, please. So I use this in my book. I use it a lot. Space is not special, just wonderfully different. When I started writing 20 years ago, it was like folks had lost their minds in space. Everything was new. We'd never seen this before. We've seen this before. We've seen it in other domains. So let's at least study the classics on strategy. Let's at least see where there's similarities and where we can learn, so we're not repeating the same mistakes over and over. But space is different, it has a different legal regime, orbital mechanics. There's no way getting around those two. So you need to acknowledge that. I teach, I write on this, but this book and the presentation and what I do when I go out and speak about it, it's not an academic exercise. It needs to have practical solutions. Otherwise, it's kind of meaningless. It's self-indulgence of the author to quote dead people and the like. The other way I usually say this is, if you want a new idea, read an old book. And that's a good place to start. Again, going back, a lot of our questions are not new. How would we address them in other ways? So speaking of old books and the people that write them. So we'll go back, the asymmetric advantage is an idea that's been part of irregular warfare for millennia. Sun Tzu wrote about it. He wrote about a variety of things about defeating a foe, achieving the most through the least amount of effort, which is asymmetric warfare is, deception and surprise, and attacking when the enemy is unprepared. So all elements of irregular. The
Kind of hard to, yeah.
that way I am? Cool. So B.H. Littlehart, when you wrote indirect approach or strategy, he was writing as a direct counter to Clausewitz. He criticized Clausewitz for his theory of warfare causing a lot of unnecessary fatalities. He thought you could win or achieve objectives, not necessarily with the use of force. So it's the indirect approach. How do you achieve your objectives without the carnage of a normal regular warfare? So part of Littlehart's ideas was movement and surprise, asymmetric attack. He doesn't write about it, but it's the use of proxies and proxy war would be part of that. But a lot of ideas that are below the threshold of optimal. J.C. Wiley wrote a book, Military Strategy, A General Theory of Power. He talks about the cumulative strategy. Sometimes it's called salami slicing, other things. But he uses the example, a cumulative strategy is the minute accumulation of little events, which by themselves are insignificant, but over time, they can add up and cause strategic effect. The counter to the cumulative strategy is the sequential, which is what he used the example of the Pacific campaign in World War II. You have to have one victory before you can have the next. Cumulative strategy is different than that. It is an element of irregular warfare. Good modern day scenario, I would say what we're seeing in the South China Sea, with China building artificial features. These, so who cares about artificial feature on an atoll? But over time, if you start establishing legal precedent and territory and having schools and people born there, they're nationalized, maybe in 20 years, folks will regret the next. All right, the chairman of the board, nobody does irregular warfare and strategy of insurgents than Mao. So there's a picture of him on the Long March from the mid-1930s. And his group was fighting the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. He had the strategy of upsetting the status quo. So he had to use time as an important element. He had to attack, retreat, fight to it for another day, just hoping the situation would change over time. And include using non-military methods as you need. So I would argue that Mao's strategy, when he writes in his writings, is the indirect approach, a lot of cumulative strategy as part of his protracted strategy. Conversation that's in the Space Force and elsewhere is this idea of competitive endurance and first mover advantage. So you've had 4-star generals in the military who said, some satellites are big, fat, juicy targets. Everything in space is vulnerable. Anyone can shoot them down. So there's this idea, what can the U.S. do to protect its interests against some of these things? So it has to do with first mover advantage or alternatively second mover disadvantage. If you have exquisite systems on orbit that we need, you're probably going to lose them in the first move, is the thinking of how it goes. So, are you better off attacking first? Sometimes people phrase it that way. We'll go, and that's probably a bad way of doing it. The United States, and I would say generally Western liberal democracies, are not going to be the aggressor. So let's just get over that. We can talk about anticipatory self-defense, preemption, the legal basis for it. There's a legal basis for it. but conflict is usually a political choice. And I think per the teachings of Clausewitz, we should expect that. I don't think US attacking first, even with the best awareness of what's going on with a threat that it knows is violent. But the good news is there is a way. So we talk about, Clausewitz talks about the defense being a stronger form of action. In today's parlance, we call that deterrence by denial of benefit. So here's a picture of me and Chris. We're at the county fair in our suits right there. So unlike boxers in the ring, so we've got like a Rocky IV scenario, where you have two boxers, and if you hit, I'm going to really hit you back and you're going to regret it. That's deterrence by punishment. Okay, that's how we think classically. If you read natural strategies, if you mess with our stuff, we'll respond in a time, place, and domain of our choosing. That's implicit deterrence. The other side of this is deterrence by denial of benefit. No matter what you do, not hurt. I have so much capability. So me and Chris here, we're going to push on each other. We're going to get hot and sweaty and get tired before anything's going to happen. So if you can have so much capabilities, ways of doing your missions, so much, call it space resilience in today's parlance. I have so many different ways of doing it. I have non-space solutions. You can knock down my exquisite satellite that's doing Earth observation. I have 1,000 others. I have commercial companies that have provided that capability. Or I have, if you knock out my command and control via satellite communications, I have fiber. I have other ways, transatlantic cables. I have other ways to get it done. So why, if you know that, why would you even attack? So that's deterrence by denial of benefit. That has promise for the first mover advantage. If folks know about your capability, then they will be less likely to attack. Sometimes I'm criticized. I emphasize the defense. You still need to have punishment. You still need to have offensive means. The two are mutually supportive. But, and I've written about it for some of my deterrence papers and the like. United States, China, and Russia have different models for deterrence, different worldviews. US is more dissuasion. I want to prevent your actions. China's Weisha translates closely to compellence, which is I'm going to stop your current actions. Then you have Russia, totally different. It's inflicting unacceptable consequences. So I am okay suffering if you suffer with. Just a different way of doing business, and we've seen that play out. All right, so one of my chapters, I'll go over this briefly, is on lawfare. So it's the intentional distortion and misuse of legal regimes for competitive advantage. Again, not a new idea, distorting the law. Seeing China do this in the South China Sea with the Philippine fishermen and fishing rights and the like. Their draft treaty for the prevention of weapons in space didn't include direct ascent ASAT. It did not include that because of their capability. So some disingenuous activities that can be distorted. In chapter 5, I did have some legal folks. The guy who coined the term lawfare back in the 1990s, Charles Dunlap, was kind enough to give a review of the chapter. It's a fascinating thing, but it doesn't involve military force, but it's using legal regimes that you can achieve your objectives that way. So what's the so what? So I quoted a lot of dead people, written a lot, believe that millennia of experience in irregular warfare. So, but for the US, whether it's competitive endurance, whether it's competing with China in space, the last chapter I try to give you, okay, what have we learned? What can we do? I'm not going to read these to you, but I do want to point out, so this shading up there is, I have 10 recommendations. There's 2/3 of those are non-material solutions. So I'm not saying build a new satellite. I'm not saying that you need to field some type of offensive weapon, but it's just changing training, education, working with allies and partners, changing your outlook. Rivals of the US, they operate below the threshold of armed conflict because it works. You're not going to stop it anytime soon. So just get ready for this protracted way of competition going forward. Updating deterrence strategies. I'll beat on my deterrence horse right now. US thinking, we still think of it as a bifurcated Deterrence is dissuasion in our interpretation, so after you have, that works in peace. Once conflict happens, deterrence has failed and you move on to military operations. We go right up our escalation ladder. We're gonna mobilize everything we got. But you can affect the decision calculus of your rivals during conflict. That's part of your escalation. So again, it's not time to give up your approaches, but I know that was a lot. But I just wanted to tee up what we're talking about. We can talk about the book, we can talk about teaching, the classes, anything you like at this time.